The Rebel Capitalist Show.
So moving on, let's talk about the wealth tax, something that's very popular in the mainstream media, and not just the United States with Elizabeth Warren and other politicians on the left, but also a lot of different countries in the developed world. I mean, I've heard New Zealand talking about it, Australia talking about it. Pretty much the only countries in the West that aren't talking about it are the European countries that have already given it a try and found that it doesn't work at all. But then also, I want to get your thoughts on that from a legal standpoint in the United States. But then also, what I've heard California talking about, which is an unrealized capital gains tax.
I mean, and that last part was going to be inevitable. I was telling people that, that one solution is this attempted, modern monetary theory and just print a lot of cash and see how that works. But some governments, of course, around the world, as the Colombians are seeing, can't do that practically.
Right.
So ultimately, the only this is all about state control, whether it's state spending, state lockdowns, vaccine passports. It's all about the state having more power in its own hands. And taxation is a natural extension of that. So why? Because that's all taxation really is. I remember, once they did the Federal Reserve, years later, a guy did a speech and he was like, well, we can print money as much as we want. We really don't need taxes to put money into circulation or to get money. We use taxes now for its power of surveillance, for its power of control, for its power to dictate people's behavior. Right. So they were always going to go down that path. And then for some governments, they have to, because printing is not a solution. It's still open question whether printing is a solution here, but to me, enough people are under that impression that that's not the real reason for their confiscatory tax expectation. The other aspect is the attempts to shut down international tax loopholes by treating all corporations somehow, wherever they make money, as having a global tax.
So, I wanted to get your opinion on that, because I've heard Janet Yellen discuss this, how we need a global standard minimum for corporate taxes. And I think that would obviously just evolve into a global minimum for income tax as well.
That's where they're going. Their goal is to prevent tax havens anywhere in the world,
right?
And to have sort of uniform, almost it's becoming like one central government. And you have one central government that collects all the taxes and then decides how it distributes amongst its constituent parts, the independent now independent countries. And the same, I think, ultimately is going to be happening with spending. And it's probably a step to one currency being one global digital currency. Yeah. Replacing the current reserve currencies based on the problem. They'll use the pretext, the problems currently with the dollar as a reserve currency and everything related to it that you've gone into great detail on. But so I think that's where they're going legally. Now they have major problems. One is most governments do not allow taxation of their citizens outside of their territory. The U.S. government's one of the only ones that do that.
Right.
And that's why the Canadians and the Irish and the English dominate in the Caribbean. You would think it'd be a bunch of U.S. people down there, but it's because if you're U.S., you still get taxed if you're in the Caribbean. So that's why, there's the Puerto Rico thing, but that's its own thing. That's why it's dominated by them. So one problem they have to overcome is getting other countries to use the U.S. system that says it doesn't matter where you are or where you made the money, that we can still tax you.
Right.
They got to get over that hurdle. Second hurdle, at least under U.S. law, tax treaties are the law of the land. So they're part of the Constitution. It's why Congress can't change a tax treaty. The IRS can't change a tax treaty. They have to get the other country to change the treaty. And the reason why that's significant is most of the real corporate tax loopholes in transfer pricing and intellectual property and captive insurance, many of them are based on tax treaties. And Congress can't change that. Yellen can't change that. The Treasury can't change that. The IRS can't change that. They have to change the treaty itself. So that's why she's talking so much about trying to use leverage to force governments to not only agree to a global minimum tax, but they really need to change their own constitutions and our treaty with them on how taxation occurs. So that will be the first big loophole, big threshold to cross.
That's good to hear that at least there's some sort of legal pushback that might slow this down or prevent it from happening altogether.
Oh, absolutely. It's a major hurdle for them to overcome. The third part is domestically with a wealth tax. I mean, the easiest place for them to go will be just to treat all income the same. And that they're basically going to do. I mean, the capital gain, talking about a capital gains rate of 43, 45, whatever it is, you add that to what the states like California and New York are going to do, you're going to be back to 1950s tax rates. But the difference, when all the left talks about, oh, look at how great the 1950s tax rates were, there were so many loopholes, nobody paid that rate.
Right.
They're going to try to make this a real 50, 60, 70% rate. So that's going to change the ball game entirely.
Yeah, and I want to point out there, Robert, the proof to what you're saying is if you just look at the tax receipts as a percentage of GDP, you'll notice in the 40s and the 50s, and when all the Krugman say are these fabulously great times for the middle class because our tax rates were so high, you notice that the amount of tax revenue as a percentage of GDP was pretty much identical to what it was in the 1980s when Reagan dropped it down to whatever it was, 25%.
Precisely. I mean, and in fact, even Carter was talking about cutting taxes at the end of the 70s. First tax cut that went through was 78, because there was bipartisan recognition that the inflationary effect on the tax rates had caused unintended deleterious economic effects. So, but the next place, though, now I think at a constitutional level on the United States, they cannot pass a wealth tax without amending the Constitution.
Okay.
You cannot tax property. That's the reason why we don't have a federal property tax, because all that is right now, any tax passed with an internal tax passed by Congress has to be uniform, has to meet certain apportionment requirements, unless it can be labeled an income tax under the 16th Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court came in and said the definition of income tax has to be limited. It can't be whatever Congress wants it to be. Right. Otherwise, it negates the purpose of the amendment. And they basically limited it and said you can only tax gain separate from property and labor. You can't tax property and labor itself. Now, the IRS has long held a different position. 1934, an IRS commissioner told Congress, people shouldn't complain about what we do tax. They should be happy about what we don't yet tax. They even proposed taxing people for making food in their own kitchen. They said that's really labor that we should stick a wage value on and make them pay a tax for cooking your own food. That was the place they wanted to go. They're going to reinvigorate some of those concepts, because the most hated tax at the time of the revolution was the head tax. It was taxing you just for existing. The second most hated tax was a tax on your farmland. But the most hated tax was the head tax, which was one of the oldest forms of English taxation. And so the goal was you can't tax me just for living. And that's why it has to be something gains separated from property and labor. Right. But they're going to try to attack that. But constitutionally, they can't. The X factor is always, does the U.S. Supreme Court uphold that? I think they will. I think they will say a wealth tax is unconstitutional. But it won't stop them from trying, and there's no guarantee the Supreme Court says that.